This video was brought to you by my loyal patrons. Pledge today and receive exclusive perks. Link in the description. 3 years ago, I made a video outlining the entire timeline of Wilbert Awdry's railway series. Every major event from 1806 to modern day, in order. It's no secret that Reverend Wilbert Awdry was obsessed with the world that he created. Every town, every railway, every engine, every noteworthy person had a history and a story behind them, and everything that happened aligned with real-world history. The lore of the Thomas the Tank Engine universe is as extensive as it is interesting. It rivals the greats, such as Lord of the Rings, with the intricacies of its lore, and how perfectly situated everything in its timeline is. Since that video though, much has been revealed about Awdry's world that we didn't know prior, all from notes that he made in his study, from uncovered letters that he wrote to fans, and from the lectures that he developed that have been revealed at the last few Awdry Extravaganza events. And with all this new information out there now, I thought now as good a time as any to update that old timeline video. A new one that goes into even further detail than before, and outlines everything. Luke Ryan, media creator of the Talyllyn Railway, who helps upkeep the Awdry study, has worked closely with me on this project, fact-checking everything and making sure all is correct and up to date here. This man really went to town on this, adding so much information to the script that I wrote up, and I am very proud with what he and I have cooked up here. Thanks for all your help, Luke. For this, we will also be using the absolutely amazing Island of Sodor map designed by 01 Salty, as we have used many times in previous videos. So a big shout out to him as well, and a link to his original work is below in the description. So, without further ado, let's dive into this. We'll turn back the clocks a couple centuries, back to where it all began. We'll begin our story in the early 1800s, when the seeds for the first ever railway on the island of Sodor were sown. It all started when copper ore was discovered in the slopes of Ward Fell in the early 19th century. The Crobensgate Mining Company formed and dug out a copper mine there. They built a horse-worked plateway from Crosney Kern to the harbor at Balladwale. Pack horses would bring copper down the Banglass Valley, which was then loaded into wagons at Crosney Kern for the journey down. In 1820, the plateway from Balladwale to Crosney Kern was relaid with fish-belly rails and extended up the Banglass Valley to the now several copper mines of Ward Fell via the use of 5 successive rope-worked inclines. As it was the first and only railway on the island at the time, it was considered a modern marvel and was quite simply known as the railroad. Over on the mainland, Robert Stephenson and Company constructed a steam locomotive called Rocket to compete in the Rainhill Trials. It won the competition, and its success caught the attention of eyes across the world. It was clear that steam power was the future, and quickly after, railways powered by steam locomotives using Rocket's design as a blueprint started to sprout all over the United Kingdom. The idea of a railway line connecting the mainland to Sodor's capital city of Sudbury was proposed. It was met with much enthusiasm from locals, though little from the mainland. Over the next couple years, the plan canvassed support from local investors at Peel Godred, promising them that they'd build a branch line north there from Cronk. In 1853, the government granted the railway an Act of Parliament, and plans were made. The railway would be called the Sodor and Mainland Railway. They attempted to gain approval for a low-level bridge over the Walney Channel to connect Sodor and England. This was the first of their many mistakes. In the north of Sodor, the seaside town of Harwich had fallen into an economic slump following pirates and smugglers using the area as a haunt for their stolen goods. The town had hoped that a railway of their own could pose a solution to this problem and provide honest work for the people in the valley. The Cronk and Harwick Railway Company was formed in 1855 with an Act of Parliament. The Sodor and Mainland Railway had taken powers to construct a branch line from Rolfs Castle to Cronk, and the plan was that at the same time the Cronk and Harwick would construct a line from Harwick to Peel Godred, and then south to meet the Sodor and Mainland at Cronk. Upon completion, the Sodor and Mainland would take lease of this line and operate it for the Cronk and Harwick. A horse-worked standard gauge railway was constructed from a stone pier at Harwick to a nearby quarry at Drogan y Clagan, Cydric IV, Bridge of Rocks, and it went no further, waiting for the Sodor and Mainland to reach Cronk. Flash forward a couple years and the Sodor and Mainland's bridge across the Walney Channel had progressed no further. The Admiralty had proven an endless obstruction, rejecting multiple of their proposed bridge designs. Having realized that they were to get no further, they put the bridge on the back burner and turned their attention to boring a tunnel through the Ballyhoo Ridge. This proved expensive and ultimately a failure. The construction was plagued with rock falls and inrushes of water, and by 1861, this project was also abandoned altogether. With their eastern section a bust, the Sodor and Mainland began work on what they should have done in the first place: the construction of their railway line at Ballyhoo. Their hope to somehow find a way to connect to the mainland was kept for a later date. They ordered 3 box tanks new from Nielsen & Company to help construct the line. The engines arrived to Sodor via ship, and were officially the first steam locomotives on the island. Number 2 was named Neil, after his builder. Following the Festiniog Railway's lead in Wales, improvements to the railroad began. Its fish belly rails up the Benglass Valley were pulled up and replaced with wrought iron flat bottom rail, as a new, more gradual route for steam engines up the Hawandui Valley was constructed. It was originally going to be a minerals-only railway, as it was prior, but as the new route was surveyed, the long-forgotten lake and hollow of Skarloey was accidentally rediscovered, and the board's thinking changed. This lakeside hollow would make for a lovely holiday spot for passengers, and so the new line was also envisioned as a passenger railway to serve it. It was given an official name, the Skarloey Railway. Skarloey itself underwent development, and villas and a hotel were built around the lakeside. The Skarloey ordered 2 engines from Fletcher Jennings & Company in Whitehaven. The first, Skarloey, was built alongside his twin, Talyllyn, who was destined for the Talyllyn Railway in Wales. With their line between Ballyhoo and Rolfs Castle finally laid, the Sodor and Mainland Railway officially opened for service. The next year they extended south to the harbour at Kirk Ronan. With this new harbour reached, ore exports out of Ballywales Wharf ceased. Skarloey was completed and arrived to Sodor via paddle ship at Kirk Ronan. Neil helped unload him. Skarloey was put to work helping to finish construction of the line. A transfer wharf between the 2 railways was constructed at Crovan's Gate. Later that year, the second engine, Rennius, arrived just in time for the Board of Trade's inspection. The directors found Skarloey to be too bouncy and demanded improvements be made to him. The line was approved, and the Skarloey Railway officially opened for passenger traffic. The next year, Skarloey was sent back to Whitehaven to be rebuilt, in which he gained a rear set of trailing wheels to fix his bouncing, as well as a cab, the newest thing for steam engines. Following the lead of the Skarloey Railway, a small horse-drawn mineral tramway in the Arle Valley adopted steam traction in 1866. The tramway had been set up some years prior by the mine owners at Cosneyhowen to gain access to the port at Arlesborough. It was laid to a gauge of 2 foot 3 inches. Over the next couple decades, other standard gauge railways across the island started to emerge. The Wellsworth and Suttery Railway Company was formed. This was to be an industrial line serving lead and zinc mines that ran along the south coast from Crosby to the island's capital in Suttery, with a middle station at Wellsworth. The stretch between Wellsworth and Suttery finished construction and opened. 2 060 saddle tank engines built by Manning Wardle were brought on to run the short line. Back up north, it had become apparent to the Cronk and Harwick that the Sodor and Mainland were never actually going to reach Kronk. By this time, another company had opened up a quarry some miles up the valley at Craigweir. They had a long haul to the pier at Harwick and objected to the cost of a standard gauge railway. After discussions with the Kronk and Harwick, they decided on a narrower and cheaper gauge of 1 foot 11.5 inches. New rail was laid from Craigweir to Drogan a Claggan, and the standard gauge rails of the existing railway were lifted and relaid to match. The track bed was retained at standard gauge width on the very slim chance that the Souterrain mainland would ever reach them. Upon seeing this, the people of Peel Godred realized that their hope for a grand rail corridor was dashed. So they took matters into their own hands. Later that year, the people of Peel Godred came together and decided to build their own railway to gain access to the west coast. And 2 years later, the Peel Godred Committee bought up the tramway in the Arle Valley, and the Mid-Sodor Railway Company was formed. Work began quickly. They pulled up the rails of the tramway and relayed it to passenger-carrying standards. The tramway reopened in 1874 with stations at Arlesdale, Marthwaite, Farquhar Road, and Arlesborough. With income flowing in, they could focus on their grand plans of a full railway up the mountain to Peel Godred. The Souterrain mainland, by this point, had been happy to keep working their already laid section of their railway. The copper ore traffic coming from the Skarloey Railway was keeping them afloat. But only just. Pressure from the railway's shareholders and the inhabitants of Vickerstown for their bridge led the railway to approach the Admiralty again about the bridge, who again proved to be obstructive to the idea. But after 3 years of campaigning, the Admiralty finally agreed to the design of a high-level bridge across the Walney Channel to the design of Mr., later Sir, Thomas Bausch. By 1879, the full Mid-Sodor Railway was nearing completion, and an order was put in for their first engine to be built at Boston Lodge Works on the Festiniog Railway in Wales. The Souterrain mainland's bridge was nearly complete after various setbacks. However, it was not to be. The bridge was destroyed one night in a devastating autumn gale. The company attempted to raise more capital for the project, but the real-life Tay Bridge disaster in December later that same year destroyed all confidence. That bridge having also been designed by Thomas Bausch. Now desperate for money, the Souterrain mainland abandoned the Vickerstown connection entirely and entered talks with other railways to amalgamate. The first engine for the Mid-Sodor Railway was completed and arrived in time for the railway's official opening. He was named the Duke, in honor of the Duke of Sodor, who at that time was Sir John Arnold Norramby and the chairman of the Mid-Sodor Railway Company. Several other engines arrived later. Following the opening of the Mid-Sodor, the Kronk and Harwick considered pushing on through the valley to meet them at Peel Godred, but sadly nothing came of it. The expenses of climbing or tunneling through the hills to Peel Godred would just be too great, let alone having to relay the entire railway a second time to match the Mid-Sodor's 2-foot 3-inch gauge. And so, the line stayed as it was, serving the quarries and the few people in the valley, paying their way, but only just. The Wellsworth and Sudbury Railway purchased a third engine, a Sharp Stewart 060 tank engine that once worked on the Cornwall Minerals Railway in the southwest of England. At some point after this, a fourth locomotive was also purchased for the railway. Other than it being an 060 tank engine, its class and origins are currently unknown. Going back to the Souterrain mainland affairs, none of the railways they attempted to amalgamate with wanted anything to do with them. The Wellsworth and Sudbury distrusted them, and the mainland railways didn't want to touch them with a barge pole. In a desperate attempt to raise funds to keep going, they sold 2 of their 3 locomotives, one of which, number 2, Neil, went to the Crovan's Gate Mining Company. The mining company did not want to lose access to Kirk Ronan Harbor, so they leased the section of the line from Crovan's Gate to there, and ran their own mineral trains down with Neil. The Ulfstead Mining Company became interested in mining out minerals in Torryrek. A lead mine was dug out, but the company needed a way to transport the minerals to a harbor. The drainage and shipbuilding company A.W. Dry & Company, began filling embankments along the River Ells to lay a railway line to Knapford. And 2 years later, Knapford Harbour was opened to export Tory Rex lead. And with the new line laid, the island's new third standard gauge railway, the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway, was opened. At this time, it was worked by horses. Over in England, a 14-year-old Topham Hatt began his apprenticeship at Swindon Works, where he worked alongside a young William Stanier. The Mid-Sodor Railway sought to encourage tourism to Sodor, and came up with the idea of forming a rack railway to climb Sodor's tallest mountain, Culdee Fell. In February 1897, construction on the railway began, with its base station at Kirkmatshan, south of Pilgodred. 3 years later, 5 engines from Winterthur, Switzerland arrived to work the new Culdee Fell mountain railway. Engine number 4, Culdee, was used to test the line prior to opening. The Culdee Fell Mountain Railway opened on June 4th, and temporarily closed about a month later after its first engine, number 1, Godred, took a tumble over the mountainside. He was subsequently scrapped, and his parts were used to repair the other locos. Back on the Mid-Sodor, the line extended further towards Pilgodred, terminating now at King Ori's Bridge. Ward Fell's veins of copper began to run out, and upon their search for more, miners discovered slate in the foothills, and thus the Skarloey Railway opened a slate quarry. With the copper traffic dwindling, slate quickly became the railway's main export. A 21-year-old Topham Hatt arrived on Sodor and began working for A.W. Dry & Company. The Sodoran mainland, through very careful maintenance, had managed to keep their only remaining locomotive working. In 1901, it was finally worked to scrap iron, and its final breakdown spelt doom for the company, with all its services ending immediately. The company went dormant, though remained in existence. Unlike the other remaining engine, Neil kept on working, shuttling slate wagons to Kirkronan Harbour. He was still confirmed to exist in 1914, but his ultimate fate after that is currently unknown. Over on the mainland, the Great Western Railway's City of Truro allegedly became the first engine to go 100 miles per hour, although the record has been debated, as his speed was determined by stopwatch timings. A narrow-gauge saddle tank engine was built at Falcon Works in Loughborough and shipped to the Mid-Sodor Railway to replace a withdrawn engine. Upon arrival, the engine was named Falcon after his builder and painted blue. During Falcon's first run up the mountain section of the line with Duke, he derailed on a curve and nearly toppled over the mountainside. Fortunately, Duke was there to keep him from falling. Down south, the Wellsworth and Suttery found its wharf at Suttery unsustainable as a harbor, for the waters were too shallow for larger vessels. They extended the line south to Brundham and established a deep-water harbor there, and their wharf at Suttery was abandoned. With this change, the rails to the wharf were taken up, and Suttery's station was moved north to a more convenient location closer to the city. At some point between this and prior to 1912, the West End extension to Crosby was finished and opened for traffic. Over on the west side, Knapford Harbour was also proving itself a nuisance. Its need to be constantly dredged made shipping difficult, so the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway sought options to extend north to the deepwater harbour at Tidmouth. They built a new coastal track around the headlands, bypassing Knapford Harbour entirely. The railway purchased their first steam engine to run this newly extended line. The engine was built by A.W. Dry & Company, designed by Topham Hatt himself. It was a rather cobbled-together thing, being essentially a portable engine boiler fixed atop a wagon chassis. It wasn't the most reliable, and after its boiler wore out after only a couple years of use, Hatt rebuilt it with a vertical boiler from a ship's donkey engine stuck on its back. With its boiler now sticking up vertically into the air, the engine gained the nickname Coffee Pot. The coastal track around the headlands was blown apart in an autumn gale, cutting off the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway's access to Tidmouth's harbour. So subsequently, using a treasury loan, A.W. Dry & Company put unemployed miners to work, boring a tunnel through the ridge to Tidmouth. By 1910, the tunnel was complete, and the Elsbridge and Knapford Railway gained rail access to Tidmouth once more. An official station at Tidmouth was built, as well as a new one for Knapford along their new main line. Upon this reopening, the railway was renamed the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge Light Railway, and ran its first train through the tunnel on July 5th. With Tidmouth now fully reachable by rail, Knapford Harbour was abandoned and fell into decline. 2 more vertical boiler engines were ordered from A.W. Dry & Company, also designed by Topham Hatt, and both with sturdier designs than the first one. Number 2 was the successor to Number 1, as at this point, Number 1 was falling apart. Number 3, meanwhile, had an enclosed design for street running in the town of Elsbridge. A 4th coffee pot was also constructed at some stage, though there is no record of a date or design. A now 30-year-old Topham Hatt married Jane Brown, the sister of Sir Handel Brown, owner of the Skarloey Railway. The Wellsworth and Suttery had found their venture of establishing a harbour at Brendam unprosperous. It was clear that Tidmouth was becoming the island's main port with its deep waters and close proximity to the Isle of Man. So they attempted to negotiate with the Tidmouth, Knapford and Elsbridge Light Railway to use their port and running powers into it. Terms were agreed upon, and the two amalgamated into one railway, the Tidmouth, Wellsworth and Suttery Railway. Work began. A line along the coast connecting Knapford and Crosby was started, with a new tunnel bored before Crosby. Topham Hatt was made engineer of the whole line. The Wellsworth and Suttery's Number 3 was sent back to Sharp Stewart to be rebuilt into a tender locomotive to handle the now longer main line. By this time, Coffee Pot Number 1 had been scrapped only after 7 years of use. A real piece of crap, that thing was. All plans were shaken in 1914, when the Great War began and all priorities changed. With war abound, the government proposed an amalgamation of the Tidmouth, Wellsworth and Suttery Railway and the Sodor and Mainland Railway to create one complete strategic railway along the south coast of Sodor as a defense against possible invasion from the west. An agreement was reached, and work on forming the North-Western Railway began. Topham Hatt was appointed Chief Mechanical Engineer of the railway, and over time he gained the nickname the Fat Director. All while this was going down, he and Jane welcomed their first son into the world, Charles Topham Hatt. Much work was done to connect the two railways. With the war abound, time was paramount, and the work had to be done fast. The new construction included the building of a double-tracked Scherzer rolling lift bridge across the Walney Channel to finally connect Sodor to the mainland, a brand new single tunnel bored through the Ballyhoo Ridge, a branch line built to the seaside town of Norramby, workshops established at Crovan's Gate, and new stations at Vickerstown, Kelstorp Road, Kildane, Cronk, and Maron. All of the main line was converted to double track, and subsequently a second bore opened up at Tidmouth Tunnel for the respective up and down lines. All of the work was done by the Northwestern Railway under Topham Hatt's direction at government expense. The Northwestern Railway's administrative headquarters and main engine sheds were based at the new station of Vickerstown. Several engines of neighboring railways were brought over to Sodor on loan to help with the construction, one of which was a K2 class tender engine from the Furness Railway called Edward. A newly built E2 class tank engine from Brighton also found its way north to Sodor during the war efforts, and stayed. His name was Thomas. When the work finally reached completion, the Northwestern Railway officially opened later that year. A naval base was established in Harwich, Sodor's northernmost town. By order of the government, work began on extending a single-track line north of Tidmouth to the new naval base at Harwich. This was part of the Northwestern's obligations as a strategic railway during wartime, so the government could run armored trains along the entire west coast in defense. By the time they had reached the Mid-Sodor's harbor in Arlesborough, the immediate threat had passed. With the potential of attack gone, the government saw no reason to continue funding the extension, and so the plans to keep extending north to Harwich were shelved. In 1918, the Great War officially ended. The end of the war brought great difficulty to the North Western Railway, as the railway was built at government expense. If the railway wished to preserve its identity and keep running, it would need to pay the cost back. 1919 was the last recorded sightings of the Wellsworth and Suttery engines, and all were in very poor shape by this point. Their ultimate fates are currently unknown, but it's assumed that they were sold off for scrap metal shortly after this. The next year, the Mid-Sodor Railway attained a couple new engines. One was a Baldwin 1012D class from America, built for use in the trenches in France during the war. Following the conflict, he was sold to the Mid-Sodor as war surplus. Upon arrival, the railway nicknamed him Stanley, after the then politician Stanley Baldwin. Get it? Because he was a Baldwin. Stanley was regauged to fit the 2-foot, 3-inch gauge railway. Another engine that was ordered was a brand new Tattoo-class tank engine from Kerr Stuart. Upon arrival, the engine was named Stuart after his builder, and painted green. The North Western Railway had no locomotives of its own. The engines that it had inherited, the Wellsworth and Suttery engines, and the 3 remaining coffee pots, were all either sold off for scrap, in a very poor state, or simply not capable of carrying out the work needed on the new roughly 80-mile main line. So until this point, the railway had been using its loaned engines to carry out the work. Upon inquiry, Topham Hatt discovered that the London, Brighton, and South Coast Railway had written off Thomas as lost in the war, and so he quietly purchased him under the table from them. Thomas became the North Western's official first engine, and was stationed at Vickerstown as a station pilot. The Furness Railway saw Edward as a shy steamer, and they had no real demand for him to return. They happily sold the aging engine to the North Western, making Edward the railway's second engine. In need of a big locomotive to manage express trains, Topham Hatt sought after an Atlantic tender engine. He desired a Robinson design Atlantic as per the ones used on the Great Central Railway. He found a seller and bought one, only to find out that he had been swindled. The engine that arrived was not an Atlantic, but a poorly designed Pacific with a tiny firebox that the seller had offloaded on him. The engine was named Henry, and he could not build steam properly. Unhappy with the engine, but desperate for motive power, Topham Hatt reluctantly kept Henry and put him to work, making him the railway's third engine. However, later that year, Henry refused to get his paint wet in the rain. He rebelled by stopping in the Ballyhoo Tunnel and refused to move, and this was especially inconvenient as the tunnel was a single bore, with the up and down lines gauntleted through it. Henry was blocking the main line in both directions. Unable to move him, Topham decided to keep Henry there as punishment, and used this as an excuse to bore a second tunnel. The tunnel now had separate bores for the up and down lines respectively. Since this incident, the tunnel had been nicknamed Henry's Tunnel. Henry remained walled up there for several months. On January 1st, the Railway Grouping Act occurred. Most of the UK's railways were grouped into 4 big companies: the LNER, the Great Western Railway, the Southern, and the LMS, all known as the Big Four. The North Western Railway was left out of this grouping. The LMS viewed it as a dying concern, still having to pay back their construction costs, so they did not pursue amalgamation. They assumed that the North Western would just go bankrupt and beg to be absorbed, so they sat back and waited for it to fall into their hands. Topham Hatt, who was freshly promoted to general manager, thought otherwise. He initiated a vigorous policy to attract tourists to the island via boat services from Fleetwood and Southport. While this was ongoing, Topham meanwhile was fed up with Henry, and had kept his eyes peeled for another better-performing express engine. To his delight, he discovered that the newly formed London and Northeastern Railway on the mainland were ridding of their Class A1 prototype, a powerful 462 tender engine named Gordon. Ecstatic to have a state-of-the-art locomotive on his rails, Topham purchased Gordon, and he was sent to Sodor with a spare boiler. Gordon became the railway's 4th engine, and for many years following, was the railway's flagship engine, as he hauled its main express service, the Wild Nor'Wester. One day, hotshot Gordon was assigned to goods work. He ended up stalling on the steep gradient between Wellsworth and Meron, and Edward was brought along to bank him. Being the first of many, many engines to infamously stall on this stretch of line, the steep grade has since gained the nickname Gordon's Hill. Following Gordon's arrival, the railway found a new purpose for Edward, and he was relocated to Wellsworth to man the branch line to Brendam. The station has since become known to the others as Edward's Station. Sometime after Gordon's arrival, Henry was finally let out of the tunnel and put back into traffic. He was cleaned up and repainted into the railway's official lined blue livery. The Peel Godred Power Company was granted permission to build a hydroelectric plant and dam a mile north of the town, using the water power of the 3 nearby lakes. But to build the plant, rail access was necessary to transport materials. They had considered the nearby Mid-Sodor Railway for this, but their bulky equipment proved too massive for the little narrow-gauge line's clearances. The power company and the Northwestern Railway agreed a deal to build a branch line north from Kildane to Peel Godred, with the power company agreeing to pay half the construction costs. The gradient of the line proved too steep for steam traction, and so it was electrified. A fleet of electric engines were brought over to service the line, and it was completed that year. Peel Godred gained a new station north of the town, and the Culdefels base station, Kirkmatshan, was extended to accommodate the new standard gauge line as an intermediate station. This new rail access to Peel Godred would soon spell doom for the neighboring Mid-Sodor Railway. Over on the west side of Sodor, landowner Jabez Crory founded the Farquhar Quarry Company, and a stone quarry was dug out at Farquhar. The company persuaded the Northwestern to extend the Elsbridge branch line to the quarry, to give them a faster means of transporting their stone to the harbor. In return, the quarry agreed to provide the stone for the bridge across the River Els free of charge, and pay half the cost of boring a tunnel at Hackenbeck. The next year, the extension to Farquhar was completed, with a tramway built through the town of Farquhar to access the quarry. The line was worked by the coffee pots. They, however, were too deficient in power to work the new longer line, and their limited braking sometimes allowed the new heavy stone trains to run out of control on the slopes. It was clear that a bigger engine was needed for this new work. Back on the east side, Thomas had grown bored of shunting coaches at Vickerstown and longed to pull a train of his own again. He made a plan with Edward and escaped Vickerstown by hauling trucks to Wellsworth for him. He lost control of the trucks on Gordon's Hill and managed to stop them just in time. Topham witnessed everything, and being sympathetic to Thomas's plight, began trialing him at Wellsworth as a shunter. However, he had bigger plans in mind for him. The Northwestern obtained its 5th engine, an experimental 260 mixed-traffic tender engine called James from the LMS. On James's first day, he ran into trouble. The trucks pushed him down Gordon's Hill, and the poor engine came off the rails near Crosby. Thomas, at Wellsworth, witnessed it all go down and set off to save James with a rescue team. As a reward for his good work, Topham reassigned Thomas to work the new branch line to Farquhar. He took it over from the overworked coffee pots, all of which were reallocated to work the quarry tramway. 1925 was a big year of change. Topham's campaign had paid off. Tourists were arriving in abundance from the new ferry routes. The traffic attracted was so great that the Northwestern held all the bargaining chips and forced the LMS to come to an agreement with them. A full cooperation that allowed a cheap traffic route from Tidmouth to London St. Pancras. And so the Northwestern gained running powers into Barrow Central Station and the LMS into Norramby, where the two ran a joint suburban service between the two stations. With this change, Vickerstown was no longer the railway's terminus, and the railway's headquarters and main sheds were moved from it to the west side of the island at Tidmouth. Later that year, James returned from repairs at Crovan's Gate, now repainted in a snazzy red livery, specially given to him by Topham as a means of making him feel better after his crash. People consistently got Henry and Gordon confused, for they looked so similar. After Henry had an incident running into a set of buffers at Tidmouth, Topham sent him to the works, and he returned back in his old green livery. Later that year, the circus came to Sodor. Its elephant escaped and hid in the Tidmouth Tunnel. Henry was sent to clear the blockage, and the elephant sprayed him in fright. Following Thomas's leave, the big engines were all left to shunt their own trains. They objected to this, and all went on strike, which subsequently made Topham consider purchasing a new pilot engine for Tidmouth. After surveying a workshop on the mainland, he stumbled across a 040 saddle tank of uncertain origins. He took a liking to him and called him Percy. Percy was purchased and became the railway's sixth engine. Following the 1925 LMS agreement and the movement of the Northwestern's headquarters to Tidmouth, the existing Vickerstown shed was deemed unnecessary. It was demolished, and a small shed was erected on the site of the old one for the locomotives operating the car ferry service across the rolling lift bridge. This, at the time, being the only way to bring cars on and off the island. At some point since, the Northwestern had established their own locomotive shed and facilities at Barrow, opposite to the LMS's equivalents. Over on the Mid-Sodor Railway, Stanley proved to be a frustration. He rode roughly and derailed often, and the men grew fed up with him. He was finally stripped of his wheels and turned into a static pumping engine behind the main shed at Arlesdale. A fire occurred at Crovan's Gate, in which the dossiers for Thomas, Edward, and Henry were all destroyed. Rather convenient, Work at the Tory Wreck lead mines had started to dwindle as the mines dried up. By 1930, it was officially abandoned. Fortunately, goods traffic on the branch line was flourishing, with the new stone quarry at Farquhar. The Ballyhoo Bypass was laid, diverting the main line along a new section of track between Henry's Tunnel and Crovan's Gate, allowing faster running on the main line and allowing more stopping passenger trains to stop at Ballyhoo. On November 30th, one of Gordon's brothers on the LNER, number 4472 Flying Scotsman, became the first engine to officially go 100 miles per hour, with recorded evidence from a dynamometer car in tow. Topham grew fed up with Henry again, and sought a solution to fix his steaming issues once and for all. Welsh coal was trialed instead of their usual supply, which seemed to amend the issue. Unfortunately though, early one winter morning, Henry had a head-on collision while pulling the Flying Kipper to Manchester, and the damage left him in a deplorable state. The crash turned out to be a blessing in disguise though, as Topham used this as an opportunity to completely rebuild Henry into something reliable. He got in contact with his old friend from Swindon, William Stanier, the now chief mechanical engineer of the LMS, and phoned in a favor. He sent Henry off to their main works in Crewe to be rebuilt. Henry returned later that year looking like a totally different engine, now built to the outline of a 460 Black 5. With that, his issues were cured, and he has proven a reliable steamer ever since, even sometimes giving Gordon a run for his money. Back up north, the quarries were finding lorries more useful than the old horse-worked railway, and by 1935 the Cronk and Harwick had been quietly abandoned. All except for the short 2-mile section from the quarry north of Craigweir to the village where most of the quarrymen lived. They were ride to work in the wagons by gravity, and be hauled home in them by horses. Things were not looking so good for the Mid-Sodor Railway either. The passenger ships from the Isle of Man had stopped docking at Arlesborough Harbour, and so passenger traffic up the mountain to Peel Godred dwindled. And by the next year, the mountain section of the railway had closed. The line now terminated at Arlesdale. The railway was kept on life support by its few still operating mines, and started to auction off some of its stock. Meanwhile, back on the Northwestern, Topham Hatt had climbed the ranks to becoming managing director. He was now truly the Fat Director. Following Henry's successful rebuild, Gordon was also sent to Crewe to be rebuilt, in which he was refitted with Stanier valve gear and a more economical 2-cylinder design. On September 1st, Germany invaded Poland, and World War II began. Following the start of the war, 2 diesel engines were loaned to the Skarloey Railway from the War Department to supplement the aging Skarloey and Rennius on slate, timber, and explosive trains. After the end of the war in 1945, both diesels left the railway. Not much is really known about them, but they were the first known diesel engines ever on the island of Sodor, and we have really no idea what they even looked like. Charles Hatt, now 26 years old, married Amanda Crory, the daughter of Jabez, owner of the Farquhar Quarry Company. And the next year, the couple welcomed their first son, Stephen Topham Hatt, into the world. The war took its toll on the railways. The original Barrow station was destroyed in an aerial attack by German bombers during the Barrow Blitz. It was rebuilt, but the Tudor-esque architecture of the original station was substituted by a brutalist design. This is the station that still stands today. Duke's Grace, the Duke of Sodor, a title then held by Robert Charles Norramby, was killed in action while fighting in North Africa. His son, Richard Robert Norramby, succeeded him as the Duke of Sodor at only age 3. The young Richard was unaware of his engine. During the war, some of the abandoned Cronk and Harwick was lifted for scrap to aid the war effort. Some track remains to this day, and if you ever take a walk up the valley from Harwick, you can see it in position, though heavily overgrown and with rotten sleepers. Remnants of the railway persist through the valley, with old rail chairs being used as doorstops and rails repurposed as fence posts. Things start to look up as the war officially ended on May 7, 1945. 5 days later, on May 12th, the first book of the Railway series was published, The 3 Railway Engines, written by Reverend Wilbert Awdry, retelling events on Sodor that he had read and heard about on his visits to the island, in which included Gordon getting stuck on the hill and Henry being shut up in the tunnel. The books would go on to be very popular, and it made the engines of Sodor quite famous. Things, however, were not so hot on the mid-Sodor. One by one, the mines they served dried up and started to close. At some point prior, Stanley had been moved from behind the shed to pump at the Kasnehauen mine. One fateful December day, he failed, and the mine ended up flooding. With this flood, the final operating mine along the Mid-Sodor Railway closed and was abandoned, Stanley included. Only a month later, with its last mine gone, the Mid-Sodor Railway officially shut down in January and auctioned off the last of its stock. Falcon and Stewart were purchased by the aluminum works in Peel Godred to assist in a 3-year expansion project there. Duke did not sell, and his Grace, the now 7-year-old Richard Robert Norramby, did not come to claim him. So he was sheeted by his crew and left in a shed. There he would rest, waiting for several years for someone to come claim him. In autumn, back on the Farquhar branch, Thomas met Terence the tractor working in a field near Hackenbeck. That winter, a heavier than usual snowfall resulted in Thomas being given a snowplow. He refused to wear it, only to get stuck in a snowdrift. Terence came to his rescue, and Bertie the bus took Thomas's passengers. Back in England, on January 1st, the Big Four railways were all nationalized and became one giant network, British Railways. The Northwestern Railway was nationalized as well, and officially became the Northwestern Region of British Railways. However, it was allowed to keep a large degree of independence from the rest of the network. Topham Hatt was made chairman of the regional executive, and thus was granted a baronetcy, attaining the title Sir, and becoming known as the Fat Controller. In the spring, Thomas met Bertie officially, and the two had their famous race to the end of the line. In the south of Sodor, the harbor at Brendam saw new life. Clay beds were discovered on the Brendam Peninsula. The Sodor China Clay Company was formed to mine them, and an industrial branch line was built from them to the harbor for exportation. 2 low-slung saddle tank engines were ordered and arrived to run the new line. They were named Bill and Ben by the Clay Company. The expansion project at the aluminum works was completed. Now with no work left for them to do, the company sheeted Stewart and Falcon until further notice. Over in East Anglia, the Wisbech and Upwell Tramway operated a branch line. The line was run by J70 class tram locomotive number 68221, Toby, and his coach Henrietta. The line had become phased out as lorries and buses took over the traffic. During its twilight days, the line was visited by none other than Sir Topham Hatt and his wife Jane on holiday with their grandchildren, a now 10-year-old Stephen Hatt and his sister Bridget. They met Toby and got on well with him. Some months after their holiday, the branch line closed, and poor old Toby's fate was left unknown. Fortunately for them, back on Sodor, Thomas had a run-in with a grouchy policeman on the tramway to Farquhar Quarry. It was brought to Sir Topham's attention that the engines running on the tramway must have side plates fitted in accordance with the law. Sir Topham remembered Toby and wrote to his controller. Not long after, Toby and Henrietta made the long trek to Sodor, and Toby became the Northwestern's 7th engine. Upon their arrival to the branch line, Thomas's single-berth shed at Farquhar gained a second berth for Toby, built with Farquhar stone, rather than brick like Thomas's. Around this time was the last known recordings of the coffee pot engines still being in service. With Toby's arrival, there was no more need for them, and they were scrapped shortly after this. A new type of slate was discovered in the hills north of Rennius. It was particularly pure and free of metallic substances, making it excellent for use in electric switchboards. The hydroelectric plant at Peel Godred found it useful, and so a quarry was dug to mine it. A spur off the Talyllyn Railway from Rennius was built to it. It was lucky that this new slate was discovered, for it helped keep the railway afloat following the Skarloey's main slate quarry falling into decline after the war. Traffic dwindled, and the railway faced hard times. Skarloey and Rennius, both well over 80 years old at this point, were in rough shape. Skarloey became unable to work, so for some time, Rennius managed the railway on his own. After majorly damaging his valve gear in bad weather, and still managing to get his train home, the owner decided that it was time to overhaul him, and sought out new motive power options. He found Stewart and Falcon at the aluminum works, and both were purchased. They were sent to Crovansgate Works for overhaul. Near Christmas, the wet weather caused a landslide just before the tunnel on Thomas's branch line. Mrs. Kindly, a lady who lived in the cottage alongside the railway, was ill in bed and witnessed it all go down. She flew a red dressing gown out her window to alert Thomas's crew of the danger ahead, preventing a serious collision. On Christmas Day, Sir Topham ran a special service up to the cottage to thank her in person for her bravery, and paid for her and her husband to take a holiday to Bournemouth. Edward stumbled across an old traction engine called Trevor, rusting away in Croc's scrapyard near Wellsworth. He convinced Reverend Charles Laxey of Wellsworth to purchase him, and Trevor has since lived happily at the Vicarage Orchard. When their overhauls were complete, Falcon and Stewart had been renamed Sir Handel and Peter Sam, after the railway's owner and controller respectively, and painted up in the Skarloey's red livery. Upon their arrival on Skarloey Metals, Rennius was finally sent away for repairs. Skarloey was placed in an open-air shed out of the way to make room for Sir Handel and Peter Sam in the main running shed. He didn't mind this, as it allowed him to see everything and not be lonely. Meanwhile, Gordon, in an attempt to protest doing goods work, accidentally ran himself off the turntable and into a ditch. Following his rescue, Sir Topham dismissed him from the Wild Nor'Wester as punishment, and James and Henry took over the service in turns. Edward, too, found himself in need of an overhaul after wearing himself out chasing down a runaway James. He was sent to Crovansgate, and while waiting his turn, caught up with Skarloey, who filled him in on everything that had happened on the line recently. On market day, the coaches rammed into Sir Handel and caused him to fall between the rails. With Sir Handel out of service, Skarloey was steamed up in an emergency to haul the market day train last minute. On his return journey, he shattered a spring and leaned to one side. He still got the train home though, and was subsequently sent away to be overhauled too. Sir Handel and Peter Sam managed the railway by themselves, while he and Rennius were both away. Everyone seemed to find themselves in trouble this year, and Thomas too was no exception. The lead spoils at the abandoned mine at Talyllyn were being cleared. On one of these clearing trips, Thomas chanced passing the danger sign there, only for the unstable ground to give way under him. Gordon was brought along to rescue him. Back at Tidmouth, the main engine shed saw a heavy rebuild. Behind the original 4-road shed gained a larger roundhouse with an indoor turntable. That Christmas, the Northwestern held a party for Mrs. Kindly in their newly completed roundhouse, as a thank you for her act of bravery the year before. 1952 was a pretty crazy year for the Northwestern Railway, with a lot of overlapping events. And such an eventful year concluded, with everyone getting plastered with a bunch of talking trains. No better way to go out than that. "1953 started out strong. The newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II made her way around all of Britain's regions. Upon the announcement that she'd be coming to Sodor, Gordon's express ban was finally lifted, and Sir Topham Hatt asked him to haul the royal train. The Ministry of Defence approached the Talyllyn Railway and offered to purchase their declining slate quarry to turn it into a base to store ammunition. Negotiations took time, for if the Ministry of Defence were to use it, the quarry's inner network had to be completely cleaned out. The process would take a few years to fully complete. At the ripe old age of 74, Sir Topham Hatt retired. His son, Charles, became the new Fat Controller. The shipping industry at Tidmouth had exploded, and it became apparent that the harbor was too small to accommodate it all. One of Charles' first plans put forward as controller was the reconstruction of Knapford Harbor, to rebuild it as a supplement to ease the congestion at Tidmouth. The plan would go into full effect the following year. Over on the Talyllyn Railway, their main loco shed was relaid to accommodate double track, enabling 4 engines to be housed within. In January, British Railways proposed its Modernisation plan, a report that called for the rapid and large-scale introduction of diesel locomotives across the network, and the phasing out of steam engines. Fortunately, the Northwestern region retained some independence thanks to the Hatt regime and resisted the new mandates as much as they could. Charles Hatt relocated Percy to Thomas's branch line to assist with the harbor reconstruction. In his place at Tidmouth, he brought a 5700 class Pannier tank engine from the western region. The engine was named Montague, but goes by Duck for his apparent waddle. Duck became the railway's 8th engine, though was allowed to keep his original Great Western number plates. With Percy on the branch line now, Farquhar Sheds was extended a second time, now gaining a 3rd berth also made of Farquhar stone. The following year, Knapford Harbor's reconstruction was completed. This reconstruction involved shutting down the original Knapford station and building a new one north of the River Ells. The branch line was reconfigured up a much more gradual grade to the new junction. With this new line, Dryaw gained a new station near the airfield, and the old Dryaw station became a goods halt for the harbor. After a mainland engine overturned on the points at Barrow, Gordon was tasked with bringing its train to London. He was delighted by the long run, but was disappointed when the station he arrived at was St. Pancras instead of King's Cross. The popularity of Wilbert Awdry's railway series had grown beyond anyone's wildest dreams, and with it came the belief that the stories were all make-believe. Charles Hatt could not abide by this, and arranged to bring his 8 famous engines to London for an exhibition, to prove their authenticity to the world. Several engines from BR were brought over to handle their work while they were away. At the age of 76, Sir Topham Hatt passed away peacefully. Charles inherited the baronetcy and became Sir Charles Hatt. The famous city of Truro was overhauled by British Railways and returned to service on Britain's main line hauling excursion trains. One of these excursions brought him to Sodor, where he met Duck, and the two talked Great Western all night long. The very first standard gauge diesel engine arrived on Sodor, in the form of a Class 08 shunter simply called Diesel. Sir Charles trialled him at Tidmouth, but Diesel only caused drama, and was sent back to the mainland in disgrace. Diesel wasn't the only diesel to arrive on Sodor this year. On the Skarloey Railway, Rusty was brought on to assist in relaying the line. The Ministry of Defense was working hard to clear out the slate quarry. It was on one of these clearing trips that Peter Sam was sent there, in which a breakaway occurred on the incline and damaged him substantially. After Peter Sam's accident, a well tank loco called Duncan was brought on as a spare engine to help with the workload. He and Rusty didn't really get along. Later that year, Skarloey finally returned home, feeling like a new engine again. Following his grand return, the BBC came to Sodor to film a live outdoor broadcast feature on the Skarloey Railway. Work began to pile up on the Northwestern, and more people arrived to visit the island. Sir Charles sent for a goods engine, number 57646, from the Scottish region to help out. And to his shock, 2 engines arrived. The twin engines called themselves Donald and Douglas. Douglas, who was in line to be scrapped back home, stowed away to Sodor with Donald, and the 2 purposely lost their numbers so Sir Charles wouldn't know which was which. The 2 spent a lengthy trial on the island, and by the time winter had arrived, Sir Charles decided to keep both engines. Donald and Douglas joined the railway, becoming its 9th and 10th engines respectively. Sir Charles promised to repaint them in a blue livery, which they did eventually receive the following year. The 60s kicked off with a bang, as a careless cleaner left Thomas's regulator open. Thomas ended up running away and crashing into the station master's house at Farquhar. He was sent to Crovan's Gate to be rebuilt. A brand new single-car DMU from Metro Camel called Daisy was built, and was sent over to be trialed on the Farquhar branch in Thomas's absence. She was snooty at first, but learned sense, and stayed. She became the Northwestern's first officially owned diesel engine. Later that year, Thomas returned home from the works with an updated design, featuring a lowered footplate and a straightened out running board. By now, the slate quarry was fully cleared. The Ministry of Defense bought it, and enclosed the area. With that, all slate traffic from Ward Fell ceased. The railway would go on to decide to use the money to fund the construction of a loop line around Skarloey Lake, which would start construction in 1963. Over on the Culdee Fell Railway, the now 60-year-old engines were aging, and it was clear that they were in need of severe overhauls. It was Culdee's turn this year, and he was sent back to Switzerland. 3 all-new engines with superheated designs were ordered. The winter rains took their toll on the Skarloey Railway. The Hawendui River overflowed and took out Rennius Bridge. Following the bridge's rebuild, one frosty morning, a low-hanging icicle knocked Peter Sam's chimney off. It was subsequently replaced with an experimental Diesel ejector. This turned out to be a worthwhile change, as it had special pipes that made Peter Sam a much better performer. He has retained it ever since, and is quite proud of it. Tired of Sir Handel's tendency to occasionally fall between the rails, the railway gave him new wheels with broader tires to hold better. The other engines dubbed them steamroller wheels. After a lengthy, nearly 10-year overhaul, Rennius finally returned home and reunited with Skarloey. The new 3 superheated Culdee Fell engines arrived from Switzerland. Number 6 Lord Harry, number 7 Alaric, and number 8 Eric. With Alaric's arrival in May, number 5 Shane Dooney was sent back to Switzerland. He'd be the final engine to make the long journey, because following this, all engines repairs were carried out on Sodor at Crovan's Gate. The newly formed Heritage Railway in Sussex, the Bluebell Railway, arranged for its flagship engine Stepney to visit Sodor on a publicity trip. He arrived to the island after a long journey, and stayed there on loan for a while. During Stepney's visit, Sir Charles trialed a Class 40 diesel on the Wild Nor'wester, though he proved a failure after sucking in an inspector's hat into his air intake, and was sent back. Stepney and Duck double-headed the express in his absence, and Stepney left Sodor for home the next day. Back on the mainland, Gordon's brothers had all begun to be withdrawn and scrapped. None were put aside for preservation, But fortunately, Flying Scotsman was saved from the cutter's torch by entrepreneur Alan Pegler. Flying Scotsman had his final run under BR ownership on January 14th. Coldy returned home to Sodor from his overhaul in Switzerland and met the three new superheated engines. Lord Harry wasn't the easiest to get along with. However, following an act of bravery rescuing a climber in a gale, Lord Harry was praised and renamed Patrick after the climber he saved. Her arrival date is currently unknown, but by 1964, the Farquhar Quarry Company had acquired a diesel shunter of their own, called Mavis, supplied to them by the Drury Car Company. Sir Charles began to consider options for ways to further ease congestion at Tidmouth and Knapford harbors. He looked north to Arlesborough, and upon inspection there, noticed that the abandoned trackbed of the nearby Mid-Sodor Railway was weed-free. Upon further examination, he discovered that the ballast used was from lead spoils of the old mines. He had a meeting with the controllers of the Skarloey and Culdifell railways, and they all went in on funding the construction of a miniature railway up the valley to mine the lead spoils. The 15-inch gauge miniature railway would be built atop the trackbed of the abandoned Mid-Sodor. Subsequently, the mostly abandoned branch line to Arlesborough was planned to be reopened, and restoration work began. A new transfer station between the two railways at Arlesborough West was built, as well as a new middle station at the seaside village of Hultra. The Skarloey Railway and Skarloey and Rennius celebrated their 100th birthdays. The celebration was marked with the opening of the newly completed loop line around Skarloey Lake. Duke's Grace, the current Earl of Sodor, now 25-year-old Sir Richard Robert Norramby, attended. On the mainland, a Class 28 diesel called Boko found his way to Brendam with a goods train. Sir Charles expressed interest in him, and British Railways, already fed up with the faulty 28 class, allowed him to keep Boko for a trial. Boko performed satisfactory and became the railway's second diesel engine. Boko's joining of the railway coincided with an incident involving Edward. While hauling an enthusiast train home, a crankpin snapped on him and sent one of his side rods flying, ripping his left side apart. He heroically managed to get the train home in spite of the damage on a single axle. Boko took over his duties on the branch line while he was away being mended. Work on the miniature Arlesdale Railway was completed and opened for traffic with Mr. Fergus Duncan as controller. It was run by three miniature tender engines brought over from England, called Rex, Mike, and Bert. Curious of the new railway, Duck was allowed up the branch line to collect ballast from them, and he got on well with the three small engines. Wilbert Awdry and his friend Teddy Boston paid a visit to the new Arlesdale Railway on one of their many Sodor holidays. They accidentally splashed Bert with their car, and Bert took it personally. Sometime after their visit, a diesel named Frank was outshopped on site at Arlesborough. Later that year, in August, Wilbert Awdry published a new book in his railway series featuring the Arlesdale Railway, titled Small Railway Engines. Frank was not included in it, as he was not finished by the time Awdry and Boston visited. He was insulted by this, and rebelled by ramming himself into the back of the engine shed. With the Arlesborough branch line now open for traffic, the demand called for its own designated engine to run it. As Duck had gotten on well with the small engines, Sir Charles appointed him, and Duck took great pride in this new responsibility. Meanwhile, back on the main line, Gordon was made aware of his brother's fate on the mainland, and became severely depressed. To cheer him up, Sir Charles arranged with Alan Pegler to bring Flying Scotsman to Sodor for the two to reunite. Sir Charles trialed two more diesels, a Class 46 number D199 and a Class 35 number D7101. D199 failed to impress after breaking down and needing to be rescued by Henry, but Sir Charles saw potential in 7101 and kept an eye on him. During one of his midnight goods runs to Barrow, Douglas stumbled across a Western Region engine there called Oliver, his auto coach Isabel, and brake van Toad hiding in the yard there. The trio were trying to make an escape to Sodor following their line in the West Country closing, and for several months had traveled BR's rails north in secret. Douglas agreed to help, and hauled them the rest of the way. The morning after, Flying Scotsman and Alan Pegler departed Sodor back for the mainland. Sir Charles found out about Oliver and was absorbed by his tale. He bought Oliver from BR, had him refurbished at Crovan's Gate, and sent him to work with Duck on the Arlesborough branch. As the line was run by two Great Western engines, the others nicknamed the line the Little Western, much to Duck and Oliver's delight. Oliver became the railway's 11th engine, but like Duck, was allowed to keep his Great Western number plates. Following the Diesel's trial, Sir Charles decided to keep 7101. After becoming a part of the railway, the engines gave him the nickname Bear for the growling sound his engine made. 1967 was another huge year for the Northwestern Railway, with a ton of events overlapping each other. In 1968, steam traction officially ended on British railways, and was banned on the main line following the final steam-hauled train, the 15 Guinea Special, on August 11th. Meanwhile on Sodor, steam continued to thrive, and became known across the United Kingdom as a safe haven for steam engines. Now 29 years old, Sir Richard Robert Norramby was finally informed about the engine named after his family's title. Consultations with Mr. Fergus Duncan, Wilbert Awdry, and Teddy Boston began to form a plan to find him. A search began along the Arlesdale Railway, examining the old track bed of the Mid-Sodor. Much of the Mid-Sodor was overgrown by this point, and Duke's shed buried by land. Duke was finally found by accident when Teddy Boston fell through the roof of his shed and landed on top of him. After 22 years of believing he'd been forgotten about, a very grateful Duke was brought to the Skarloey Railway for restoration, and was reunited with Sir Handel and Peter Sam. All the little engines, together at last. In 1970, the now 29-year-old Stephen Hatt married Helen Margaret. And 2 years later, they welcomed their first son, Richard Topham Hatt, into the world. In 1972, Wilbert Awdry published his final book in the Railway series, book number 26, Tramway Engines, and retired from writing. For a long time, Bert had trouble steaming. He was refitted at Arlesborough with a cold chap blast pipe and taller chimney, and a taller cab to match. Finally, his trouble with steaming was cured. An ancient Bloomer-class locomotive was discovered in an old shed in Wigtonshire, Scotland by Sir Charles. The engine, affectionately called Bloomer, was brought to Sodor to be refurbished at Crovan's Gate, and was outshopped just in time to take part in the cavalcade at Shildon for the 150th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. Mr. Fergus Duncan had recognized the Arlesdale was in need of a new engine, and so a new build locomotive was started at Arlesborough Works. In 1976, the new locomotive was finally outshopped in a yellow undercoat. The yellow paint reminded Douglas of the Highland Railway engines back in Scotland, which were nicknamed Jocks. The name stuck, and Jock quickly proved to be the strongest engine on the miniature railway. The Jubilee Bridge was built across the Walney Channel, and named in honor of the Queen's Silver Jubilee. Fun fact, the actual real Jubilee Bridge was built here in 1908, and named in honor of Queen Victoria. But Awdry shifted the dates around to make the timeline work. This now provided a direct road path onto Sodor. Prior, the Northwestern Railway ran a car ferry service from Barrow to Vickerstown over their drawbridge. With the new road bridge built, this service was extinguished, and Sir Charles saw to it that his railway was given substantial compensation. Over in Kildane, a motor rail terminal was opened. The Northwestern's motor rail service was a popular one. It ran for nearly 20 years until 1995, when British Rail ended all motor rail services across the network. Nearing 60 years old, Gordon started becoming worn out and grew tired easily. He was sent to Crovan's Gate for a tune-up. While he was away, the railway suffered an engine shortage, so the unusual trio of Thomas, Percy, and Duck triple-headed the Wild Nor'Wester. The Talyllyn Railway in Wales was in a crisis. Their number 3, Sir Hayden, was in desperate need of repair and was likely to be out of action for a while, leaving them with a locomotive shortage. Thankfully, the Skarloey was in the opposite position following Duke's return to steam, and had motive power to spare. They sent over Sir Handel at once to cover for Sir Hayden. While there, Sir Handel ran into a low-hanging branch and injured his eye. He was given an eye patch until it healed, which he was rather embarrassed about. After an 11-year hiatus, Christopher Awdry took up his father's mantle and continued the Railway series. His first book, Really Useful Engines, was published this year. At the age of 70 years old, Sir Charles Hatt retired, and Stephen Hatt became the new Vat Controller. Tidmouth Shed suffered some major damage when a visiting diesel, BR number 40125, slipped on oily rails and crashed through its rear wall. The diesel was sent away after this, never to return. Fun fact, the real 40125 was scrapped in 1983, which is an unfortunate inconsistency in the timeline here. Meh, just don't think too hard about it. Britt Allcroft's television adaptation of the Railway series books, called Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, premiered on October 9th. The show was a home run success, and went on to make the already famous engines of Sodor known worldwide. Sir Handel returned to Sodor at the end of the 1984 running season, having spent 2 years away on the Talyllyn Railway. In September, the Skarloey Railway opened a funicular railway at Skarloey Station, now providing visitors easy transport from the station down to the village on the lake. It was a joint venture between the railway and the lakefront hotels, splitting the profit nearly 50-50. Around 1986, Percy fell ill, and Stephen Hatt brought over a diesel from BR to help out. To everyone's shock, it was Diesel. Diesel saw a change of heart during his second Sodor stint, and the engine's opinions of him changed after he helped rescue Thomas out of a sticky situation. Diesel was sent back to BR sometime after this, and is believed to still be around today. Meanwhile, Gordon continued to feel his age, and the idea of a high-speed train taking over his job was teased. After a rough patch with Stephen Hatt, he once again proved himself still worthy of pulling the Wild Nor'wester, but an inevitable future still loomed. Over on the Dean Forest Railway in Gloucestershire, one of their resident austerity saddle tanks was renamed Wilbert after their then chairman, Reverend Wilbert Awdry himself. Awdry was present for the naming ceremony. Following an incident at Knapford Harbour, a barge called Bulstrode was permanently grounded on Knapford Beach. The bridge over the River Hackenbeck was in need of repairs, so a temporary weight limit was put on it. Thomas was too heavy for the bridge, and so was sent to work on the Brendam branch in the meantime. While at Brendam, he met Bill and Ben for the first time. The Talyllyn Railway invited Peter Sam to come work there for a while. He left Sodor this year, and remained on the Talyllyn until 1996. While he was away, a new diesel for the railway was purchased and overhauled at Crovan's Gate, combining the best parts of two of the same type to make one good engine. The end result was a cabless diesel named Fred. Thomas was invited to take part in a railway show at the National Railway Museum in York. He attempted to make the journey there by himself, though plans went awry when he collided with a faulty crossing gate. Needing repairs, Thomas made the rest of the journey there by road via a low loader. The Railway Museum handled his repairs. During his time in York, Thomas double-headed a train with the preserved V2 class Green Arrow to the seaside town of Scarborough. Thomas stayed in York through the winter. A heavy snowfall that year caused trouble back on his branch line. Daisy got stranded in a blizzard, and the later snowmelt took out the bridge over the River Hackenbeck, and they just repaired it too. Later that year, Thomas finally returned home. Henry was sent to Crovan's Gate for his next big overhaul. A locomotive crisis at Tidmouth had Henry brought out of the works earlier than expected, and he ran for a short while in his unfinished red undercoat. Heavy workload on the Little Western made Stephen Hatt consider purchasing an austerity saddle tank engine to assist. Before committing, he reached out to the Dean Forest Railway and asked if he could trial Wilbert for a while. Wilbert came to Sodor and helped out on both the Farquhar and Arlesborough branches. He went home later that year, leaving Stephen certain that an austerity saddle tank was just what his railway needed. And it was never brought up again. A rare loose end in the series, though it's probably safe to assume that he obtained one. 50 years had passed since the first Railway Series book was published, and so Stephen Hatt planned a big Golden Jubilee ceremony at Tidmouth Station. The high-speed train car set called Pip and Emma brought a royal personage to Sodor. The visitor was the then Prince Charles, who declared all the engines a credit to Stephen Hatt. Peter Sam finally returned home from his long stay at the Talyllyn, and shared tales of his adventures to two young cleaners named Kathy and Lizzie. He did return again for a short while after this, staying till the end of the 1999 season. Meanwhile, a new steam engine for the Skarloey Railway was built in their own works at Crovansgate Wharf. A naming ceremony was held, which unveiled him named in honor of the Skarloey's chief mechanical engineer, Ivo Hugh. On March 21st, 1997, at the age of 85, Reverend Wilbert Awdry passed away peacefully in his sleep. A dark year this was, as Sir Charles Hatt also passed on this year, at the age of 83. Stephen inherited the baronetcy and became Sir Stephen Hatt. On November 20th, British Rail officially ceased operations, having slowly been sold off and privatized since 1994. We can only assume that the Northwestern region was privatized during this era, and became the Northwestern Railway once more. Much like Sir Handel and Peter Sam, Duncan made his way to the Talyllyn for a visit this year and would stay there until 2007. After this, the Skarloey locomotive's visit to the Talyllyn would be more sporadic and short-lived, mainly for events and galas. In 2007, an old dilapidated Furness railway coach turned garden shed was discovered in the brush near Elsbridge. Her name was Victoria, and she was sent to Crovansgate for restoration. Upon her return to the rails, she became a part of Toby's new vintage train service with Henrietta. Sir Stephen made some updates to the Wild Nor'Western's operation, and started running a new non-stop long-distance service from Tidmouth to London, cutting out the changing of trains at Barrow. For this, Pip and Emma, the high-speed train set, were purchased. This new service put an end to Gordon's reign as the flagship engine of the railway, and he was forced into retirement, after hauling the Wild Nor'Wester for an impressive 88 years. He is still used for short-distance expresses, however, and is enjoying this new, quieter life. The island celebrated the centenary of Wilbert Awdry, and a bust of him was unveiled in Tidmouth Station. The then Prince Charles visited Sodor again to present it. And on July 6th, the final book of the Railway series was published. Book number 42, Thomas and His Friends. Back on the mainland, Flying Scotsman returned to steam on Britain's main line after an extended 10-year overhaul, and he is still running long-distance excursions today. In 2024, Sir Handel visited the Talyllyn Railway again for their annual Awdry Extravaganza event, and for the first time ever met his real-life twin, Sir Hayden. Carr, a young upstart, beat Sir Handel in a race to bring glass, cementing his place in the storied history of the Railway series. At the grand old age of 83, Sir Stephen Hatt was still confirmed to be the current controller of the Northwestern Railway. Richard Hatt is no doubt destined to become the next Fat Controller, but Sir Stephen has so far given no hints of retirement yet. On May 12, 2025, the Railway series will celebrate 80 years since its very first book was published in 1945. For this pick of the week, I'd like to recommend Bunker Down, a tank engine story by Windwatch 98. This is a lovely story showing a new side of Thomas's life as a station pilot before the events of his book. I always love seeing new takes on the Northwestern early years stuff. It's an area of the timeline ripe of untapped story potential. It's beautifully filmed and directed, as all his videos are. Definitely worth a watch. Some of you may have noticed that the illustrations used in this video look a little different than the ones that I usually use. And you'd be right, because I rescanned all the illustrations from Wilbert's books for this video with a brand new scanner. All the colors are much truer to the actual paintings, and far less contrasty and grainy. Just like before, I'm making these scans free to the public, and you can find them in the drive link below. Feel free to use them in your own videos or edits. Put them on the wiki, do whatever you want with them. They are my gift to you all. I do want to apologize for the delay with this video. I'd originally planned to have it out much earlier this month, but I had some family matters to attend to. My grandfather passed away, and we were all down in California for a week to be with family and mourn. We're all back now though, and we're all doing fine. My schedule for the rest of the year got a bit skewed though, so let me run through my current plan. The next video will be part 5 of the How I Built the Layout series. I have made some serious progress on it since the last time you all saw it, and I am really looking forward to sharing that with you all. Lots to cover there. After that will either be the Season 13 retrospective or a new Sodor's Finest. I think I'm leaning more towards the retrospective to get through 5 seasons of the show this year before 2025, and then Sodor's Finest will kick off the new year. But that may change. We'll see how I feel. And I think that's about it from me, folks. Once again, a massive thank you to Luke Ryan for all the help on this video. Could not have done it without you, man. Go follow him and the Talyllyn Railway on all their socials. All links are in the description below. See you soon, everyone. Bye-bye.